Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk. I'm Keith Menconi. As I record this, we are now 3 whole days into Tsai Ing-wen's presidency. And of course, all eyes were on her inauguration speech delivered last Friday, as observers around the world are trying to get a sense of what direction Tsai will be leading Taiwan in. Now, one of the most important audiences watching on is the United States. It's an important supporter, trade partner of Taiwan, but it has in the past also been somewhat skeptical of DPP leadership, with some concern that a Tsai presidency would mean more instability in the Taiwan Strait. So US-Taiwan ties, they can be complicated, somewhat fraught, difficult to get a handle on, really. So today, that's what we're going to be trying to do, getting a handle on the shape of those ties now that U.S. policymakers have gotten their first glimpse of what a Tsai administration will look like. And also, today we're going to be trying to get a feel for what possibilities there are, what direction that relationship could go in. To help us out with all that, we're welcoming back to the program Rupert Hammond-Chambers. He is the president of the US-Taiwan Business Council, which is a group working to strengthen US-Taiwan business ties. I recently spoke with him through Skype. Rupert Hammond-Chambers, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on your show.
So I spoke to you about a year ago, and at the time, of course, we were looking forward to the election. We didn't even really know quite who the candidates would be yet. And we were trying to figure out how the course of that election might impact U.S.-Taiwan ties. Now, obviously, we know a lot more than we did back then. Tsai made her inauguration speech just last Friday. So now what we're going to be doing is, now that we know just a little bit more, trying to figure out how the Tsai administration might interact with the U.S., how the U.S. Might be interacting with the Tsai administration. But before we even get to that, let's kind of just lay all of the cards out on the table, because I remember at the time when I spoke to you, you had some fairly critical words for the Obama administration. You were making the argument that he wasn't really engaging with Taiwan as much as he could be, wasn't supporting Taiwan in some of the ways that you feel Taiwan needs to be supported. So let's update that assessment a little bit now a year later. Do you feel like anything has changed, or would you make a similar criticism?
I would. I had an opportunity to write something in the Wall Street Journal last week in which I laid out some of the challenges that Tsai would face. Some of those related to the present state of U.S.-Taiwan ties and what I would describe as the Obama doctrine's approach to Taiwan, which is one of rhetorical consistency, but substantially or substantively there lacks really a material component to that is underpinning the relationship between the two sides, and that is regrettable. And I would expect that to continue through until January of next year and the arrival of a new U.S. president.
All right. So now skipping ahead to the Tsai inauguration, do you think that changes anything substantially about the relationship? I mean, of course, the U.S. Historically, if we look back to 2012, there was a fair amount of unease among a lot of U.S. policymakers that were afraid that she might rock the boat and cross strait ties, and China would respond negatively, might lead to some instability in the region. But now that they've gotten to know her a little bit better, seen perhaps a new tone in the election running up to this inauguration, do you think that assessment has changed at all?
Well, Keith, I'm not sure that the issue necessarily in Taiwan-U.S. ties is whether or not there'll be any adjustment on the U.S. side vis-a-vis Tsai, who is moderate, who has laid out a set of policies, I think, that certainly should provide for stability. The X factor, of course, is China, and the Chinese have already raised tensions since January over a number of actions, and in my view, that we're going to continue to see that. We're going to continue to see a spike in provocations from the PRC, and it's then how will the U.S. respond? Do we just have more rhetorical words of support, or does it look perhaps a little bit more like the second Bush administration under Chen Shui-bian, where there was a lot of pressure on Taiwan to accommodate China? Now, Chen Shui-bian and Tsai Ing-wen are very different people, and I expect them to have very different governments. But the worry is, for me, that the U.S. government will lean on Tsai and force her or attempt to pressure her to make accommodations to China, all in the interest of stability. And of course, it has exactly the adverse effect. It simply promotes more instability.
Right. Make that case a little bit. So the idea there being that if there's more imbalance in the Taiwan Strait, then China would be encouraged to be somewhat more aggressive?
Yeah, my own view is that China is looking to spike tensions because they view it to be in their interest. They'd like to see Tsai and the DPP government on the defensive, and they'd like to see the U.S. on the defensive. The last thing that senior U.S. government officials want, or one of the last things they want, is to have to go into every meeting with PRC officials, and the first thing they hear is a complaint about the possibility of Taiwan independence. It immediately puts the U.S. on the defensive. But with all the other issues in PRC-U.S. relations at the moment, my view is that the Chinese see that as a positively useful tool to push back on the U.S. and put the U.S. on the defensive. So I expect more of that, quite frankly, particularly over the next 8 months. Obviously, those of us in the U.S., we don't know who the next U.S. president is going to be, and neither do the Chinese. So they're going to have to deal with some new personality in the new administration, 2017 and beyond. But certainly in the next few months, my own view is that China feels like they've got some operating room with Taiwan, and they also feel like it's unlikely the Obama administration are really going to push back in any meaningful way.
I've been hearing a number of people making the argument that at this point, Taiwan doesn't even really factor that big into the U.S.'s regional calculus, just because if we look at the major disputes between the U.S. and China, that would be the South China Sea, a couple of other regional things. Taiwan just doesn't hold that much sway, specifically in the South China Sea. Would you agree with that? It sounds like you're saying, though, that Taiwan could almost be used as a tool in those sorts of disputes.
Well, I wouldn't fold the South China Sea into the case I've just made, although I do think that the PRC has used Taiwan in that way in the past. Tsai is not without tools herself, and it's interesting that you raise the South China Sea. Of course, the largest island in the South China Sea, Taipei Island, is held by Taiwan, and Taiwan certainly has interests in equities, and China's claim on the South China Sea comes through Taiwan. So Taiwan does have a role to play in all of this. I think it'll be very interesting to see what the Tsai government does after The Hague comes forward with its ruling on sovereignty in the South China Sea, specific to the Philippine case as it relates to Chinese islands, and whether or not that forces or offers an opportunity for the Tsai government to make an adjustment to Taiwan claims. That, to me, is a very interesting dynamic. So there is a possibility that Taiwan has a role. At the moment, in the run-up to this, these actions that the KMT government were making in the last several months, I think that had more to do with trying to box Tsai in, as opposed to any sort of flurry at the end of the Ma government.
Right, just in terms of all the visits that they were making to those islands, etc.
Right. I think they're concerned, too, that the DPP might make an adjustment. So we had Ma there trying to reestablish or heighten the role of Taiwan sovereignty in the South China Sea, and then as an extension how that relates to China's own sovereignty claims.
Taking a look for a second, just specifically at her speech, because it was a very anticipated speech. Observers around the world were trying to see exactly how she would characterize the relationship between Taiwan and China. Of course, she omitted any mention of the 1992 consensus, instead opting to note that there was a meeting in 1992 and affirming the agreements that were made there. So a very different change to the wording, leaves out any mention of a one China policy, anything like that. But it seems like so far, despite the fact that China has issued its displeasure with her characterization of it, it seems like most U.S. officials are saying, well, she didn't rock the boat too much, this is acceptable to us. So how much do you think that her speech that she just made is going to matter to folks in Washington, other observers in the U.S.?
I think it does matter to folks in Washington, those people who are focused on this issue. I think, again, it reiterates the view that certainly in the last couple of years, Tsai has been moderate and responsible in the statements and actions that she's made as it relates to the relationship with China. So I think that all underpins that. Really, just to bring it back around again, to me, really what we should be focused on, though, is how the Chinese behave. And the Taiwan Affairs Office already had statements out afterwards saying that it was unacceptable. What sort of actions, beyond what have already been taken, what sort of escalations can we see out of China as they relate to Taiwan? How will that manifest itself in respect to pressure on the U.S.? And how will the U.S. respond? Will the U.S. push back? Will it just be rhetorical, or will there be actual actions that demonstrate U.S. displeasure over Chinese pressure and coercion? So I think that, to me, is really the focus in respect to this issue, or should be.
Right. It does seem like as a number of commentators at ICRT have noted, the ball seems to be very squarely in the Chinese court at this point.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that you and your colleagues are right on the money.
Now, just in terms of U.S. policy towards Taiwan, the Obama administration is winding down. Both of the two expected candidates for the U.S. presidency would most likely have a very different approach to foreign policy. Even, Hillary Clinton, who is also a Democrat, is expected to have a more hawkish approach to foreign policy. Do you see the election in the U.S. coming up as an opportunity for a complete reboot of U.S.-Taiwan relations, or are external factors going to matter more than the person in the White House?
That's great. Well, personalities certainly matter, Keith, as you and I both know. So for both candidates, who they choose to have in the key posts will matter, and to the extent that they have a good understanding of Taiwan and visited Taiwan and are familiar with the nuances and intricacies of the relationship and the responsibilities that go with it, that will matter. We know a wee bit more about that with Clinton, and we know much less about it with Trump, of course. Either way, the Chinese seem to have calibrated that they're in for a harder go of it with either Trump or Clinton. And that's going to impact us, because I think that the Chinese are going to... That creates uncertainty in the next few months, and that's hard to say. A reboot of Taiwan policy? I don't think so. I think for those of us who really work in this space, what we would simply be happy with is a strong commitment to the Taiwan Relations Act, a movement back towards a more robust trade relationship. Let's hope with TPP as part of it, and also importantly on the security side, consistent material support for Taiwan's defense needs, which obviously the Obama administration got away from in the 4-year arms freeze they had that ended last fall.
All right, now just to round out this conversation, looking now to the Taiwan side, I mean, I know that we did just basically say the ball is very much in China's court, but are there material things that the Thai administration could be doing to up their engagement with the U.S. and making it clear that some of these actions, some of these policies that you'd like to see the U.S. take, make it clear that Taiwan is, also ready to engage in those ways and also ready to, step up those ties?
Oh, definitely, Keith. I mean, I think, not to sound like a stuck record, but I think that the what Taiwan has heard a great deal about are some of the long-standing irritants in the bilateral economic relationship. And even though the prospects for TPP remain tenuous at this juncture, I certainly think that Tsai government could remove a huge irritant in the relationship by addressing the issue of pork unilaterally. I think that would be well received in Washington, D.C. as a demonstration of seriousness and intent. And with the majority that the DPP has in the Li Yuan, I also believe that some of the regulatory barriers in the commercial relationship between the two sides also could be dealt with unilaterally. What Taiwan will often hear, as trade negotiators will often hear, is for Taiwan to look at Chorus as a possible model, the U.S.-Korea free trade agreement for liberalization. The Ma government, in my view, really took 8 years off in respect to macroeconomic reform on the island, focusing almost exclusively on growth through opening up of China. But many of these competitive issues that need to be addressed have to be addressed through reforming the economy. And a lot of this stuff that the Tsai government can do unilaterally. And in the short term, there is likely to be some pain and some dislocation, in the longer term, Taiwan should be far more competitive as a consequence.
Well, if she does pursue these things aggressively, we might be seeing domestic strife as well really picking up in the next couple of months, because any mention from her ministers over the last couple of months that their approach to ractopamine bans and their approach to pork imports, I mean, there were protests right off the bat, even when such a change was just implied. So what do you expect to see? I mean, do you expect her to be able to, given those domestic realities, do you expect her to be able to take some of those steps?
Well, my feeling, Keith, is yes, she is committed to doing this. I think my best understanding of what's going on right now is that, to come back to the fortunes of TPP in the United States, it really what's happening now is that she and her senior economic and national security colleagues are watching to see what happens in the general election here, and then as a consequence what the fortunes for TPP look like, and then she can better calibrate how to time making some of these changes and commitments. But my view is she is focused like a hawk on the big picture and is willing to take a short-term hit or to spend political capital in making these changes in the interests of broader and bigger goals.
So even now, after this election has ended, still we're going to probably see a little bit of a wait-and-see period before the U.S. Election really comes into focus.
I think that is the truth. Certainly on issues like TPP, I suspect that, in fact, one of my colleagues and I were in contact this morning over the possibility that things will start moving a little bit on the China trade legislation that's been sitting there for almost 2 years. The legislation related to processing China agreements and then what to do with the services agreement itself. It certainly would be a demonstration of good faith to push those two through, although the Chinese seem to be grumbling a little bit about the first of those two pieces of legislation. I still, for me, think that while it would be a demonstration of good faith on her part, the Chinese would in all likelihood brush it aside and continue to focus on the absence of commitment to the 92 consensus.
All right. Well, we're going to leave that conversation here for today. Obviously, a lot of question marks still in the air that are going to be resolved over the next couple of months, but we have been speaking today to Rupert Hammond-Chambers. He is the president of the US-Taiwan Business Council. Rupert, thanks for speaking to us again.
Keith, it's absolutely my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk. Of course, Taiwan Talk is ICRT's weekly interview segment, bringing you conversations from and about Taiwan. Podcast listeners are going to want to look out for the release of a segment that I'm very proud of. It was recorded a number of weeks ago on The Morning Show with Terry Engel, and we were talking about the Armed Forces Network Taiwan, which is the English language radio station in Taiwan that preceded ICRT, broadcast from about the 1950s all the way up until the U.S. Army departure from Taiwan in 1979. So a lot of interesting history there. We got some very knowledgeable people to join us, talk about it, share some clips from that time. Very interesting segment. That'll be released in just a couple days, so definitely stay tuned to the channel. Look out for that. But that is it for the program today. Thank you once again for listening. For ICRT, I'm Keith Manconi. See you next time.